humans too! You're
When
a
flight attendant
disgrace!
Patricia Hendricks told 10-year-old Keturah to sit down and be quiet, she had no idea the little girl had just recorded everything on her tablet, and that recording was already being sent to someone who could end her career in minutes. But to understand how a fifth grader ended up in a confrontation 30,000 feet in the air, we need to go back to the beginning of that day. Back to when Keturah Abioye woke up at 5 in the morning, too excited to sleep, because today was the day she'd been waiting for all year. Today her class was flying to Washington D.C. for their 5th grade field trip. And today would be Keturah's very first time on an airplane. Keturah was 10 years old, a quiet girl from Oakland, California, with deep brown skin and hair braided into neat cornrows decorated with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved her head. She wore her Oakwood Elementary uniform, a navy blue polo and khaki skirt, pressed crisp and clean because her mother had ironed it the night before. And if you looked into Keturah's eyes, you'd see something unusual for a child her age. They were bright, curious, always watching, always noticing things that other kids might miss. Things that adults might miss too. Keturah was the daughter of Nigerian immigrants. Her father, Keturah Abioye, was a civil rights attorney in Oakland, the kind of man who took cases other lawyers wouldn't touch because he believed in justice more than money. Her mother, Amara, was a journalist who'd spent years reporting on inequality in education and housing. From the time Keturah could walk, her parents had been teaching her two things that seemed contradictory but somehow worked together. Speak up against injustice but be smart about how you do it. Know your rights. Document everything. Use your voice but use your head too. Most 10-year-olds spent dinner talking about cartoons or video games. Keturah's family talked about current events, about fairness, about what it meant to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. And while other kids thought this sounded boring, Keturah loved it. She loved learning. She loved understanding how the world worked. And she especially loved that her parents treated her like her thoughts mattered, like she was capable of making a difference even though she was just a kid. But she was still a kid. And today she was just excited about getting on a plane for the first time, seeing the monuments she'd studied in class, and spending 3 whole days in the nation's capital with her best friend and classmates. Speaking of her classmates, Keturah's 5th grade class at Oakwood Elementary was special. Not because they were smarter than other classes or better behaved, but because they were close. Really close. The kind of class where everyone knew everyone else's business, where kids looked out for each other, where the bonds they were forming would probably last long after elementary school ended. There was Jemima, who sat next to Keturah in class. She was 9 years old, a year younger than most of the 5th graders because she'd skipped a grade. Jemima's parents had immigrated from Haiti when she was 3, and while she spoke perfect English now, she still spoke Haitian Creole at home with her grandmother. Jemima was shy, the kind of girl who got anxious when called on in class even when she knew the answer. She bit her nails when she was nervous, and she was nervous a lot. But she was also kind, always sharing her lunch with kids who forgot theirs, always the first to help clean up after art class. Then there was Azariah, Keturah's best friend since kindergarten. Azariah was Keturah's opposite in many ways. Where Keturah was quiet and observant, Azariah was loud and outgoing. She laughed easily, made friends with everyone, and had opinions about everything. But underneath all that confidence, Azariah had something in common with Keturah. She couldn't stand unfairness. If someone was being picked on at recess, Azariah was the first one to step in. If someone was left out of a game, Azariah made sure they got included. She wore her heart on her sleeve, and if you hurt someone she cared about, you'd know exactly how she felt about it. There was Benaiah, 11 years old and already 5'4", which made him taller than some of the 8th graders. People who didn't know him always assumed he was older, more mature, maybe even intimidating. But Benaiah was gentle, soft-spoken, and absolutely obsessed with history. He could tell you everything about the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, ancient Egypt, you name it. He'd been looking forward to this Washington, D.C. trip more than anyone because he'd get to see the museums and monuments he'd only read about. Benaiah's parents had taught him to be careful, though. They'd had the talk with him early, about how people might perceive him because of his size and his skin color, about how he needed to be extra polite, extra careful, extra everything just to be treated fairly. And there was Tabitha, 10 years old with vitiligo that created patches of lighter skin across her face and arms. Kids used to ask her about it all the time when she was younger, and it made her self-conscious. She wore long sleeves even in summer, kept her head down in the hallways, always sat in the back of the classroom. But this year something had changed. Maybe it was Mrs. Okonkwo's constant encouragement. Maybe it was her classmates treating her like it was no big deal. Whatever it was, Tabitha had started coming out of her shell, started raising her hand in class, started smiling more. She was still self-conscious, still worried about what people thought, but she was trying. And her classmates loved her for trying. All of these kids, along with 28 others, were part of Mrs. Okonkwo's 5th grade class. Mrs. Okonkwo was in her 50s, a warm Nigerian woman who'd been teaching at Oakwood Elementary for 23 years. She had the kind of presence that made you want to behave in class, not because you were scared of her but because you didn't want to disappoint her. She believed every single one of her students was capable of greatness, and she told them so every single day. She'd been planning this Washington D.C. trip for months, coordinating with parents, filling out permission slips, making sure every student could afford to go by organizing fundraisers. The class was diverse, 16 black students and 16 white students, which perfectly reflected the neighborhood Oakwood Elementary served. Mrs. Okonkwo loved that about her class. She loved how her students learned from each other, how they celebrated each other's cultures, how they didn't see their differences as dividing lines but as things that made their classroom richer. On that Tuesday morning in late April, all 32 students met at the school at 6 a.m. with their packed bags and permission slips. Parents hugged their kids goodbye, some crying, some taking last-minute photos, some giving final warnings to behave. Keturah's father had driven her to school, and before she got on the bus, he bent down, looked her in the eye, and said something she'd remember later. "Keturah, be observant. Be kind. But if you see something wrong, don't be silent. We didn't raise you to be silent." The bus ride to the airport was loud and chaotic, exactly what you'd expect from 32 excited 5th graders. They sang songs, played games, shared snacks. Keturah sat next to Azariah, both of them looking out the window as the city passed by, both of them dreaming about what Washington, D.C. would be like. At the airport, Mrs. Okonkwo herded them through security like a shepherd with very energetic sheep. She counted heads obsessively, reminded them about staying together, repeated the buddy system rules for the 100th time. And finally, after what felt like hours of waiting, they boarded the plane. The aircraft was massive, at least to kids who'd never been on one before. Keturah's eyes went wide as she walked down the jet bridge. The smell of recycled air and cleaning solution. The cramped aisle. The overhead compartments. The neat rows of blue seats stretching toward the back. It was exactly like the movies and somehow completely different. The 32 students spread throughout the economy section, most of them in middle seats because that's all that was left when the school had booked the flight. Mrs. Okonkwo sat up front in row 7, where she could keep an eye on everyone. Keturah ended up in row 15 middle seat, between Azariah by the window and a white student from their class in the aisle seat. Jemima sat 2 rows back with Benaiah and another classmate. Tabitha was toward the back, squeezed in a middle seat between 2 white students. The energy in the cabin was electric. Kids were taking photos, texting their parents, marveling at the safety cards, fighting over the armrests. The white students in the class were just as excited as the black students. This was a field trip, an adventure, a memory they'd all share. In those first few minutes, everything felt perfect. And that's when the flight attendants began their pre-flight checks. There were 3 flight attendants on this flight, but the one assigned to their section was a woman named Patricia Hendricks. She was in her mid-40s, blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing the airline's navy blue uniform with a small golden wings pin on her lapel. She had one of those smiles that looked pleasant enough at first glance, but if you paid attention, and Keturah always paid attention, you'd notice the smile never quite reached her eyes. It was the kind of smile people wore when they were doing their job, not when they actually meant it. Patricia began working her way down the aisle, checking seat belts, helping students stow their bags, reminding them to turn their phones to airplane mode. And this is where Keturah noticed something. Something small. Something that anyone else might have dismissed as nothing. When Patricia approached the white students in their class, her voice was warm, almost musical. "Well, hello there, sweetheart. First time flying? Oh, how exciting. Let me help you with that bag, honey. There you go. Make sure that seat belt is nice and snug. Perfect. You're going to have such a wonderful time in Washington." But when she reached Jemima, just 2 rows behind Keturah, her tone shifted. Not dramatically. Not obviously. But it shifted. "Seat belt fastened? Phone away. Good. Short. Clip. No warmth. No excitement. Just efficiency." Keturah noticed. But she told herself she was imagining things. Maybe Patricia was just tired. Maybe she was having a bad day. Maybe Keturah was being too sensitive because her parents always taught her to watch for these things. When Patricia reached Keturah's row, she barely made eye contact. "Bags stowed? Seat belts on? Stay in your seats once we take off." And then she moved on. But when she reached the white student in the aisle seat next to Keturah, that warm voice returned. "Oh sweetie, is this your first flight too? Don't worry, it's perfectly safe. If you need anything during the flight, you just push that call button right there, okay? We're here to make sure you have the best experience possible." Keturah sat there in her middle seat, hands folded in her lap, and thought about what she'd just observed. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was reading into things. But something in her gut told her to pay attention. Something her father had taught her: trust your instincts, Keturah. If something feels wrong, there's usually a reason. So Keturah made a mental note. Just in case. Just to see if this pattern continued. Because if there was one thing her journalist mother had taught her, it was this: once is an incident, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is a pattern. And patterns told you something true about the world. The plane's engines roared to life. The flight attendants took their seats. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing their flight time to Washington, D.C. And as the aircraft began rolling toward the runway, Keturah looked around at her classmates, all of them buzzing with excitement, none of them noticing what she'd noticed, and she hoped with everything in her 10-year-old heart that she was wrong. But deep down, she had a feeling this flight was going to be nothing like what they'd expected. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're already hooked by Keturah's story and want to see how this plays out, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss what happens when this 10-year-old takes on an entire system 30,000 feet in the air. And here's a question I want you to think about. Have you ever noticed something that seemed wrong but convinced yourself you were just being too sensitive? Drop your answer in the comments, because what Keturah does with her instincts is about to change everything. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and for about 30 minutes, everything seemed normal. The kids settled down after the excitement of takeoff. Some pulled out books. Others listened to music on their phones. A few stared out the windows at the clouds below, marveling at how small everything looked from up here. Keturah tried to relax, tried to convince herself that what she'd noticed during boarding was nothing, just her imagination running wild like her father always joked it did. But then the snack cart came rolling down the aisle, pushed by Patricia Hendricks, and Keturah's gut feeling came roaring back. Patricia started at the front of the section, working her way back row by row with that same tight smile plastered on her face. And as Keturah watched from row 15, she saw the pattern emerge again. Clear as day. Undeniable. When Patricia stopped at row 8, where 3 white students from their class sat together, her voice rang out cheerful and bright. "Good morning, sweetheart. We have cookies, pretzels, or fruit snacks today. Which would you like?" The girl by the window chose cookies. The boy in the middle picked fruit snacks. The girl in the aisle seat asked for pretzels. Patricia handed each snack over with a smile, added a napkin, even threw in an extra packet for the boy who'd chosen fruit snacks. "There you go, honey. Enjoy." Row 9. 3 more white students. Same routine. "What can I get for you today? Cookies, pretzels, or fruit snacks?" Choices offered. Preferences honored. Napkins distributed with care. Row 10. Row 11. Row 12. Every white student got the same treatment. The question. The choice. The warm tone that made them feel like valued passengers. And then Patricia's cart reached row 13, where Jemima sat in the middle seat between Benaya and another black student from their class. Keturah sat up straighter in her seat 2 rows ahead, watching intently, hoping she was wrong about what was about to happen. Patricia reached into her cart, pulled out 3 bags of pretzels without a word, and handed them to the 3 students. No question. No choice. Just pretzels placed on their tray tables like she was dealing cards. For a moment, nobody said anything. Benaya looked at his pretzels, then at Patricia's cart where he could clearly see the cookies and fruit snacks. The other student just accepted what he was given. But Jemima, sweet shy Jemima who hated confrontation more than anything in the world, gathered every ounce of courage she had and spoke up. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, shaking slightly. "May I have cookies instead, please?" Patricia stopped, turned, looked down at Jemima with an expression that made the temperature in the cabin drop about 10 degrees. "You get what you get and you don't get upset." Her voice was cold, flat, nothing like the warm tone she'd used just moments before with the other students. "That's what my kids learned. It's a good lesson for everyone." Jemima's face fell. Her eyes immediately filled with tears, but she blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. She nodded, looking down at the pretzels she didn't want, and Keturah could see her shoulders hunching inward, making herself smaller, the way she always did when she felt embarrassed or ashamed. Patricia moved on to the next row like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just treated a 9-year-old girl completely differently than she'd treated every white student on that plane. Keturah's hands clenched into fists on her armrests. Azariah, sitting by the window, had seen the whole thing too. She leaned over and whispered, "That's not fair. Did you see that?" She didn't even ask Jemima what she wanted. "I saw it," Keturah whispered back, her voice tight. "Should we say something?" Azariah asked, but even as she said it, Keturah could hear the uncertainty in her friend's voice. Say something to who? Patricia clearly didn't care. And what were they going to do? Make a scene at 30,000 feet? When Patricia reached their row, she didn't offer choices to them either. 3 bags of pretzels appeared on their tray tables. The white student in the aisle seat looked confused, glanced at Keturah and Azariah, opened his mouth like he might say something but then closed it again. What could he say? He'd gotten pretzels too. But he hadn't noticed that moments before, Patricia had offered his white classmates in the rows ahead full choices. Keturah stared at those pretzels and felt something burning in her chest. Not anger, not yet. Something else. Something that felt like a door opening in her mind, like suddenly seeing something that had always been there but that she'd never fully understood before. This was what her parents talked about. This was what all those dinner table conversations were about. This was discrimination happening right in front of her, so casual and smooth that if you weren't paying attention you might not even notice it. But Keturah noticed everything. The snack service continued. Patricia worked her way to the back of the plane and the pattern held. White students got choices. Black students got pretzels, handed to them without question, without warmth, without the basic courtesy of being asked what they preferred. By the time Patricia returned her cart to the galley, Keturah had made a decision. She pulled her tablet out of her backpack, the one her parents had given her for schoolwork, the one that had a voice recording app her mother had helped her install for recording interviews for her journalism class. She opened the app, tested it quickly to make sure it was working, and then set the tablet on her lap, recording light blinking quietly. If this kept happening, she'd have proof. Not just her word against an adult's. Actual evidence. About 20 minutes later, the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began moving around the cabin, stretching their legs, lining up for the bathrooms. And that's when the second incident happened. Benaiah had been holding it since before they took off, too excited and nervous to use the bathroom at the airport. But now, 45 minutes into the flight, he really needed to go. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up from row 13 and made his way to the aisle. There was already a line. 2 white students from their class stood waiting for the bathroom at the front of the section, chatting quietly, completely relaxed. Benaiah got in line behind them, patient, polite, just waiting his turn like everyone else. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds before Patricia appeared from the galley. She took one look at the line, at the 3 students standing in the aisle, and her eyes zeroed in on Benaiah. "Excuse me," she said, walking directly toward him, that tight smile absent now, replaced with something stern. "You need to sit down. You're blocking the aisle." Benaiah looked at her, confused. "I'm waiting for the bathroom, ma'am. I can see that several people are waiting." Patricia gestured toward the line as if Benaiah couldn't see the 2 students standing right in front of him. "Go back to your seat and wait your turn properly." Benaiah stood there for a moment, trying to process what she just said. Wait his turn properly? He was waiting his turn. He was standing in line like everyone else. The 2 white students in front of him weren't sitting down. Why did he have to? "But he started. Now please." Patricia's voice had an edge to it, an edge that Benaiah recognized immediately. It was the edge his parents had warned him about. The edge that meant if he pushed back, if he argued, things would escalate in ways that wouldn't be fair but that would somehow become his fault. So Benaiah did what he'd been taught to do. He nodded, said, "Yes, ma'am," and walked back to his seat, face burning with embarrassment, very aware that other passengers had watched the whole exchange. Patricia didn't say a word to the 2 white students standing in line. Didn't ask them to sit down. Didn't tell them they were blocking the aisle. She just returned to the galley like her job was done. The 2 white students looked at each other, uncomfortable, clearly aware something wasn't right about what had just happened. But they didn't say anything either. What were they supposed to say? Benaiah slid back into his seat in row 13 and Jemima, sitting next to him, whispered, "Are you okay?" "I still need to use the bathroom," he muttered, staring at the seat in front of him, jaw clenched tight. 3 rows up, Keturah had watched the entire thing. Her tablet was still recording, sitting on her lap, and she'd angled it toward the aisle when she saw Patricia approaching Benaiah. She'd captured the whole interaction. Patricia's tone. Her words. The way she'd singled Benaiah out while ignoring the white students doing the exact same thing. Keturah looked around at her other black classmates. Several of them had noticed too. You could see it in their faces. The confusion. The hurt. The growing awareness that something was very wrong with how they were being treated. Azariah leaned close to Keturah and whispered, "This is messed up. She's treating us different." "I know," Keturah whispered back. "I'm keeping track." "Keeping track of what?" Keturah showed her the tablet, the recording app still running. Azariah's eyes widened, then she nodded slowly. "Good. We need proof." About 15 minutes later, the plane hit turbulence. Not bad turbulence, just enough to make the aircraft bounce and shudder, enough for the seatbelt sign to ding back on and for the captain's voice to come over the intercom asking everyone to return to their seats and buckle up. Most passengers complied quickly, used to this routine. But the sudden jolts made some people nervous, especially kids who'd never flown before. Toward the back of the section, in row 23, Tabitha sat squeezed in her middle seat, uncomfortable and trying not to panic as the plane shook. Tabitha had always been self-conscious about taking up space. Her vitiligo made her feel like people were always staring at her, judging her, and she'd learned to make herself as small as possible to avoid drawing attention. But right now, being small wasn't helping because the white student in the seat to her right had spread out. His elbow was over the armrest, pressing into her space. His leg was angled toward her, taking up part of her foot room. And Tabitha was pressed against the left armrest, trying to give him room, her body twisted at an uncomfortable angle. The turbulence got a little worse. A few passengers gasped. Someone's bag fell from an overhead compartment. And that's when Patricia came through doing safety checks, making sure everyone's seatbelts were fastened. She worked her way down the aisle, checking each row. "Seatbelt fastened? Good. Stay seated until the sign goes off." Row by row, quick and efficient. When she reached row 23, Tabitha saw her chance. She'd been sitting uncomfortably for over an hour now, too timid to say anything to the boy next to her, but maybe the flight attendant could help. Maybe she could at least ask. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Tabitha's voice was quiet, hesitant. "I don't have much room. Could I maybe?" Patricia barely glanced at her. "Everyone needs to stay in their assigned seats. Make it work." She said it dismissively, already moving to check the next row, like Tabitha's discomfort wasn't even worth acknowledging. Tabitha felt her face get hot. She nodded, looked down at her lap, felt tears prickling at her eyes. Of course. Why had she even asked? Why had she thought anyone would care? But then 2 rows ahead, Patricia stopped. There was a white girl from their class sitting in a similar situation, cramped in a middle seat, looking uncomfortable as the passenger next to her took up extra space. And Patricia's entire demeanor changed. "Oh honey," she said, her voice immediately warm and concerned. "You look so uncomfortable there. Let me see if we have another seat for you. You shouldn't have to be squished like that." She pulled out her passenger manifest, checked something, then smiled. "You know what? We have an empty seat in row 16 and it's got extra legroom. Come on, sweetie, let's get you moved." The white girl, looking relieved and grateful, unbuckled and gathered her things. Patricia personally helped her move to the better seat, even helped her stow her bag in the new overhead compartment, chatting pleasantly the whole time about how she wanted to make sure all the kids had a comfortable flight. Meanwhile, Tabitha sat in row 23, still cramped, still uncomfortable, watching this happen with tears now actively running down her cheeks. The boy next to her noticed, looked embarrassed, tried to pull his elbow back a bit, but the damage was done. Tabitha had asked for help and been dismissed. Another student, a white student, hadn't even asked and had received immediate assistance and an upgrade. The message was crystal clear. Keturah, from her seat in row 15, had watched the whole thing unfold. She'd heard Patricia dismiss Tabitha. Watched her move the white student to a better seat. And something inside her 10-year-old chest just snapped. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't Patricia having a bad day. This wasn't Keturah being too sensitive or reading into things. This was discrimination. Clear, undeniable, systematic discrimination happening to her friends, her classmates, the kids she'd known since kindergarten. And it was happening because of the color of their skin. Keturah looked down at her tablet, still recording. She had almost an hour of audio now. Patricia's different tones with different students. Her dismissal of Jemima. Her singling out of Benaiah. Her treatment of Tabitha versus the white student. All of it captured. But audio alone might not be enough. Adults could dismiss what kids said. They could claim the kids were exaggerating or misunderstanding. Keturah knew this because she'd seen it happen before at school, when students reported unfair treatment and nothing changed because it was the kids' word against the adults. She needed to do more. She needed to tell someone who could actually do something about this. The turbulence eased. The seatbelt sign dinged off. And Keturah made her decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, and started making her way toward the front of the section where Mrs. Okonkwo sat. Azariah grabbed her hand as she passed. "What are you doing?" "Telling Mrs. O," Keturah whispered back. "Are you sure? Maybe we should just—" "No." Keturah's voice was firm, more firm than Azariah had ever heard it. "This isn't okay. Someone needs to know." She continued up the aisle, tablet clutched in her hands, heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was scary. She was about to tell on an adult, accuse a flight attendant of treating them unfairly, and she had no idea what would happen next. But her father's words echoed in her head. "If you see something wrong, don't be silent. We didn't raise you to be silent." Mrs. Okonkwo was reading a book when Keturah reached her row. She looked up, saw Keturah's face and immediately knew something was wrong. "Keturah? What is it?" Keturah slid into the empty aisle seat next to her teacher and spoke quietly, carefully, aware that other passengers might hear. "Mrs. O, something's happening on this flight. The flight attendant, Patricia, she's treating us differently. The black students. She's not giving us choices for snacks like she does the white students. She made Benaiah sit down when he was waiting for the bathroom but not the white kids in front of him. She moved a white student to a better seat but told Tabitha to just deal with being uncomfortable. I've been recording it on my tablet. I have proof." As Keturah spoke, she watched Mrs. Okonkwo's face transform. Her teacher's warm expression hardened, her jaw tightened, her eyes grew sharp and angry. But it was a controlled anger, the kind that came from years of professionalism, years of dealing with situations exactly like this. Mrs. Okonkwo took a deep breath. "Let me handle this, Keturah. Thank you for telling me. You did the right thing. But Mrs. O. I will handle it." Mrs. Okonkwo's voice was gentle but firm. "Go back to your seat. I promise you I will address this right now." Keturah nodded and made her way back to her seat, past rows of students who had no idea what was about to happen, past Patricia who was in the galley preparing for the beverage service. Mrs. Okonkwo stood up, smoothed her blouse and walked straight to the galley where Patricia was organizing cups and cans. Keturah couldn't hear the conversation from her seat, but she watched it happen, watched her teacher speak calmly and professionally, watched Patricia's face shift from surprise to defensiveness. After a moment, Mrs. Okonkwo's voice rose just slightly, loud enough that passengers in the nearby rows could hear. "Excuse me, I've noticed some concerning treatment of my students. Several of them have complained." Patricia cut her off, her voice sharp and dismissive. "Ma'am, I'm doing my job. If you have a complaint, you can file it after the flight." The condescension in her tone was barely concealed. She was speaking to Mrs. Okonkwo the way you'd speak to someone who was bothering you, someone who was being unreasonable, someone who needed to be put in their place. Mrs. Okonkwo stood there for a moment, and Keturah could see her teacher doing the same calculations that Benaiah had done earlier, that Tabitha had done, that every black person learned to do when confronted with this kind of dismissal. Push back and risk being labeled aggressive, difficult, the problem. Or step back and let it go knowing nothing would change. "I will definitely be doing that," Mrs. Okonkwo said finally, her voice cold and controlled. "You can count on it." Patricia gave her a tight smile that looked almost smug and walked away to begin the beverage service, completely unconcerned, completely confident that nothing would come of this complaint because nothing ever did. Mrs. Okonkwo returned to her seat, and Keturah could see the frustration and helplessness on her teacher's face. Mrs. Okonkwo was an adult, an educator with 23 years of experience, and even she couldn't get this flight attendant to take her seriously. And that's when Keturah realized something that would change the course of this entire flight. The adults couldn't fix this. Not right now. Not at 30,000 feet with another hour left before landing. Patricia wasn't going to suddenly start treating them fairly just because Mrs. Okonkwo had complained. The complaint would be filed after the flight, investigated eventually, maybe result in some disciplinary action weeks from now. But right now, in this moment, nothing was going to change. Unless Keturah did something about it. She looked down at her tablet, at the recording still running, at the evidence she'd been carefully collecting for the past hour. And she remembered something else her mother had taught her. Her mother, the journalist who'd spent her entire career documenting injustice, exposing wrongdoing, holding people accountable through the power of evidence. "Documentation is power, Tura," her mother always said. "When you have proof, they can't dismiss you. They can't pretend it didn't happen. You make it real." Keturah opened her email app, attached the audio file she'd been recording and began typing. The email was addressed to her father, the civil rights attorney, The man who spent his days fighting exactly this kind of discrimination in courtrooms and boardrooms and anywhere else it showed up. The subject line was simple: "Dad, I need help. Discrimination on our flight." The message was brief: Patricia Hendricks, flight attendant. Treating black students different than white students. Have been recording everything. Please help. Flight lands in 1 hour. She hit send, watched the email whoosh away into the airplane's Wi-Fi system, and then sat back in her seat, hands shaking slightly but her mind clear. If Patricia thought this was over, if she thought she could dismiss Mrs. Okonkwo's complaint and continue treating them however she wanted, she was wrong. Because Keturah Abioye, 10 years old, student at Oakwood Elementary, daughter of immigrants who'd taught her about justice and courage and speaking up when it mattered, wasn't going to stay silent. Not when her friends were being hurt. Not when discrimination was happening right in front of her. Not when she had the power to document it, to prove it, to make sure people knew what was really going on. The beverage service cart started rolling down the aisle again, Patricia pushing it with that same tight smile, and Keturah watched her approach, watched her offer warm greetings and full choices to the white students, watched her hand drinks to the black students without asking what they wanted. And Keturah kept recording, kept documenting, kept building her case. Because this flight wasn't over yet. And before they landed in Washington, D.C., before this field trip continued, before Patricia Hendricks walked away from this aircraft thinking she'd gotten away with treating children differently based on their skin color, Keturah was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what had happened. The question wasn't whether she had the courage to speak up. Her parents had raised her for this exact moment. The question was whether the adults around her, whether the airline, whether the system would actually listen when she did. And Keturah was about to find out. If you're on the edge of your seat wondering what Keturah does next and how Patricia responds when she realizes she's been caught, hit that subscribe button right now because this story is about to reach a point where a 10-year-old girl takes on an entire system, and you won't believe what happens next. Let me ask you something. If you were Keturah's age and watching this happen to your friends, would you have had the courage to document it and speak up, or would you have stayed quiet to avoid trouble? Drop your honest answer in the comments because what happens next will show you exactly why Keturah's choice matters. About 90 minutes into the flight, the lunch service began. The aroma of reheated airplane food wafted through the cabin as Patricia emerged from the galley pushing another cart, this one stacked with meal trays wrapped in plastic. The captain had announced earlier that today's lunch options were chicken pasta or turkey sandwiches, and most of the kids perked up at the mention of food. Even airplane food sounded good when you were 10 years old and hungry. Keturah watched Patricia start at the front again, watched her approach the first row of students with that now familiar selective warmth. Her tablet sat on her lap, still recording, the audio file now over an hour long and growing. "Good afternoon, sweetheart." Patricia's voice rang out to a white student in row 8. "We have chicken pasta or turkey sandwich for lunch today. Which would you prefer?" The girl thought for a moment. "Chicken pasta, please." "Excellent choice, honey. Here you go. There's a roll and a cookie in there too. Enjoy." Row 9. Same routine. "What would you like, dear? Chicken pasta or turkey sandwich?" The boy chose turkey. Patricia handed it over with a smile, added a napkin, made sure he had everything he needed. Row 10. Row 11. Row 12. Every single white student received the question. Every single one got to choose their meal. Patricia's voice remained cheerful, patient, warm. And then she reached row 13, where Benaya sat with 2 other black students from their class. Patricia didn't ask. She simply placed 3 turkey sandwiches on their tray tables. No question. No choice. No acknowledgement that these were human beings who might have preferences about what they put in their bodies. Benaya stared at his sandwich. He wanted the pasta. He'd wanted it since the captain announced the options. But after what had happened with the bathroom earlier, after being singled out and embarrassed, he didn't have the energy to speak up. He just unwrapped his sandwich and ate it in silence. The student next to him did the same. But Keturah noticed something. She noticed these kids weren't just accepting what they were given anymore. They were noticing the pattern. They were seeing what was happening. And the awareness was written all over their faces, in the tightness around their eyes, in the way they avoided looking at each other, in the collective shame of being treated as less than. Patricia continued down the aisle. Row 14. 3 white students. "What would you like today? Chicken pasta or turkey sandwich?" Choices offered. Preferences respected. Row 15. Keturah's row. Patricia arrived with her cart, and without a word, without even making eye contact, she placed 3 turkey sandwiches on their tray tables and started to move on. The white student in the aisle seat looked confused. He raised his hand slightly. Excuse me? Can I actually get the chicken pasta instead? Patricia stopped, turned, and her voice immediately warmed. Oh, of course, sweetheart. I'm so sorry, I should have asked. Let me get that for you right away. She retrieved the turkey sandwich, replaced it with chicken pasta, and even gave him an extra cookie. There you go. My apologies for the mix-up. She continued to the next row without acknowledging that she'd done the exact same thing to Keturah and Azariah, handed them meals without asking, but their requests for changes apparently didn't matter. Keturah felt Azariah tense beside her. Her best friend was staring at the turkey sandwich on her tray table with an expression that Keturah recognized immediately. Panic. Fear. The look Azariah got whenever the topic of her food allergies came up. Keturah, Azariah whispered, her voice tight. I can't eat this. What do you mean? I'm allergic to deli meat. Like really allergic. My mom wrote it on all my medical forms. Mrs. O has the papers. Azariah's hands were shaking as she pushed the sandwich away from her. If I eat this, I'll get really sick. Like, need to go to the hospital sick. Keturah's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about preferences anymore. This wasn't just about being treated rudely or dismissed. This was about Azariah's health, her safety. And Patricia had just handed her something that could seriously harm her without bothering to ask if she had any dietary restrictions. You need to tell her, Keturah said firmly. I don't want to cause trouble, Azariah whispered, but her eyes were already filling with tears. What if she gets mad? What if she doesn't believe me? Azariah, you could get sick. You have to say something. Patricia had moved on to row 16 now, still offering choices to white students, still handing predetermined meals to black students. Azariah watched her for a moment, gathering courage, and then raised her hand. Excuse me? Her voice was quiet, anxious, the voice of a girl who desperately didn't want to be a problem but who knew she had no choice. Miss Patricia? Patricia glanced back over her shoulder, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. Yes. I'm sorry, but I can't eat turkey. Azariah's voice shook. I'm allergic to deli meat. May I please have the chicken pasta instead? Patricia's face hardened. She didn't push her cart back toward Azariah's row. She just stood there, several feet away, and responded in a tone that made it clear she thought Azariah was being difficult on purpose. You should have mentioned dietary restrictions when your parents booked the flight. But I did, Azariah's voice cracked. It's on my medical form. My teacher has it. Mrs. Okonkwo has all our allergy information. Patricia cut her off, her patience clearly exhausted. I don't have time for this. I have an entire cabin to serve. If you can't eat what you were given, then just don't eat it. And with that, she turned back to her cart and continued down the aisle, leaving Azariah sitting there with a meal she couldn't eat, tears now streaming down her face, hungry and humiliated and completely dismissed. The cabin felt frozen. Several passengers had witnessed the exchange. Some looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The white student who'd successfully gotten his meal changed looked horrified, staring at Patricia's back like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Keturah felt something inside her snap completely. All flight long she'd watched. She'd documented. She'd reported to Mrs. Okonkwo. She'd done everything she was supposed to do, everything the adults always told kids to do. Tell a grown-up, let them handle it, don't make waves. But nothing had changed. If anything, it had gotten worse. And now her best friend, her ride or die since kindergarten, the girl who'd stuck by her through everything, was sitting there crying because a flight attendant couldn't be bothered to care about her legitimate medical condition. No more watching. No more waiting for adults to fix this. No more staying quiet. Keturah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Azariah grabbed her hand. Keturah, what are you doing? What I should have done an hour ago, Keturah said quietly. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. She picked up her tablet, made sure it was still recording, and walked down the aisle toward Patricia. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Every instinct told her to sit back down, to not make herself a target, to let the adults handle this even though they clearly couldn't. But stronger than that instinct was the memory of her father's voice. If you see something wrong, don't be silent. And the memory of her mother's words, document everything. Make them see what's really happening. Patricia was at row 19 now, handing meals to more students, when Keturah reached her. Excuse me, Miss Patricia? Patricia didn't even turn around. Whatever it is, it can wait until I'm finished with the service. No, it can't. Keturah's voice was louder now, clear enough that passengers in several nearby rows could hear. My friend is allergic to what you gave her. She needs the chicken pasta. Patricia finally turned, looking down at Keturah with barely concealed irritation. "Sit down, young lady. This is not your concern. It is my concern." Keturah felt surprisingly calm now that the moment was here. All the fear had burned away, replaced with something fierce and focused. "You've been treating us differently all flight. You gave the other kids choices about their snacks and meals but not us. You helped one student move to a better seat but told my friend to deal with being uncomfortable. And now you're refusing to accommodate my friend's allergy when you changed that other boy's meal 2 minutes ago just because he asked." The cabin had gone completely quiet. Passengers were putting down their books, taking out their earbuds, turning to watch this 10-year-old girl confront a flight attendant. Patricia's face shifted, her irritation morphing into something darker. When she spoke, her voice was low and dangerous. "You're being disrespectful. Sit down right now, or I will have the captain informed of your behavior, and we will have security waiting for you when we land." Keturah felt her stomach drop at the threat, but she didn't back down. Instead, she held up her tablet so Patricia could see it. "I've been recording everything since the snack service. How you offered choices to some students but not others. How you made my friend Benaiah sit down when he was waiting for the bathroom but not the white kids doing the same thing. How you moved one student to a better seat but refused to help my friend Tabitha. How you dismissed my friend's serious allergy. All of it is documented." The air seemed to leave the cabin. Patricia's eyes widened, then narrowed. Several passengers immediately pulled out their phones, suddenly very interested in what was happening. "Recording on an aircraft without permission is illegal," Patricia hissed, her professional mask completely slipping now. "Give me that device right now." "I already sent it to my father," Keturah said calmly, even though her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the tablet with both hands to keep it steady. "He's a civil rights attorney. He's probably listening to it right now." That was a slight exaggeration. Her father had the file, but Keturah had no idea if he'd opened it yet, but the effect on Patricia was immediate. Her face flushed red, her composure cracking. "Give me that tablet." Patricia reached for it, her hand shooting out to grab the device from Keturah's hands. Keturah stepped back quickly, holding the tablet against her chest. "Don't touch me, please." Her voice was still calm but louder now, making sure everyone nearby could hear. "And actually, recording in public spaces for documentation of discrimination is protected. My dad explained it to me. Airplanes are public accommodations." "You're a child?" Patricia snapped, losing her composure entirely now. "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know anything about the law. Do not touch my student." Mrs. Okonkwo's voice cut through the cabin like a whip. Keturah's teacher was rushing down the aisle, her face a mask of controlled fury, her professional demeanor barely containing her rage. She positioned herself between Patricia and Keturah, her body language protective, her eyes blazing. "Step back from her right now," Mrs. Okonkwo said, her voice low and dangerous. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. "I'm trying to do my job and this child is interfering." "This child," Mrs. Okonkwo interrupted, "is documenting discrimination that I reported to you over an hour ago. Discrimination that you dismissed. And now you're threatening her for speaking up about it?" Other passengers were openly filming now. At least 5 phones were pointed at the scene, capturing everything. An older white woman in row 17 spoke up, her voice carrying authority. "I've been watching this whole flight. This flight attendant has been treating the black children completely differently. What this girl is saying is true." A white man across the aisle nodded. "I saw it too. During the snack service. During lunch. It's been consistent." Another passenger, "She made that tall boy sit down for waiting for the bathroom but not the other kids." Patricia looked around, her face going from red to pale as she realized the cabin had turned against her. Passengers who'd been silent witnesses for the past 2 hours were suddenly willing to speak up, suddenly willing to corroborate what Keturah had been documenting. "This is ridiculous," Patricia stammered. "I've been doing my job. I treat everyone the same." "No, you don't." Keturah's voice was quiet but steady. "And I have proof. An hour and 43 minutes of audio proof. Every interaction. Every time you offered choices to white students but not black students. Every dismissal. Every double standard. All of it." Patricia stared at her, and Keturah could see the moment the flight attendant realized the situation was beyond her control. She couldn't confiscate the tablet, too many witnesses. She couldn't dismiss the complaints, too many people had seen what happened. She couldn't threaten Keturah anymore, not with half the cabin recording and a teacher standing protectively in front of her student. "I'm reporting this to the captain," Patricia said finally, her voice shaking. "You'll be hearing from." Yes, please do report it to the captain, Mrs. Okonkwo interrupted. I think he needs to hear about everything that's happened on this flight. I'm sure the airline will be very interested in the documentation this student has compiled. Patricia looked at Keturah one more time, her expression a mixture of anger, fear, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding that her career was in serious jeopardy. Then she turned and stormed toward the cockpit, leaving her lunch cart abandoned in the aisle, visibly shaking as she disappeared behind the curtain that separated the cabin from the flight deck. The cabin erupted in quiet murmurs. Passengers whispered to each other, some praising Keturah's courage, some expressing shock that they'd witnessed discrimination so blatant, some wondering what would happen next. Mrs. Okonkwo turned to Keturah, her expression softening. Are you okay? Keturah nodded, but now that the confrontation was over, the adrenaline was wearing off and her hands were trembling badly. Is Azariah going to get her pasta? Mrs. Okonkwo's face tightened. I will make sure of it. Go back to your seat, Keturah. Let me handle the rest. Keturah walked back to row 15 on shaking legs, feeling dozens of eyes on her. When she slid back into her middle seat, Azariah immediately grabbed her hand and squeezed it hard. You didn't have to do that, Azariah whispered, tears still on her cheeks but something like awe in her voice. Yes, I did, Keturah said simply. Because that was the truth. She did have to. Not because she wanted to be a hero or make a scene or get attention. But because her friends were being hurt, and she had the tools to document it and the courage to speak up about it. Because her parents had raised her to understand that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of injustice. Because at 10 years old, she already understood something that many adults never learned, that standing up for what's right is more important than staying comfortable. Benaiah leaned forward from the row behind them. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Tabitha, who'd gotten up and come over from her seat in the back, whispered, You stood up for all of us. Jemima, still sniffling from earlier, just hugged Keturah from across the aisle. And Keturah sat there, surrounded by her friends, her hands still shaking but her conscience clear, and waited to see what would happen next. She'd done everything she could do. She'd documented the discrimination. She'd reported it to her teacher. She'd confronted Patricia directly. She'd stood her ground even when threatened. She'd sent the evidence to her father. Now it was up to the adults to actually do something about it. And somewhere in the cockpit, Patricia was presumably explaining her version of events to the captain, completely unaware that her version wouldn't matter. Not when there was an hour and 43 minutes of audio documentation. Not when multiple passengers were willing to testify to what they'd witnessed. Not when a 10-year-old girl had been brave enough to say out loud what everyone else had been too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The discrimination had been real. It had been systematic. It had been undeniable. And Keturah Abioye had made sure no one could pretend otherwise. If this story is gripping you and you want to see how the airline responds to Keturah's evidence and what happens when they finally land in Washington, D.C., smash that subscribe button right now because the resolution to this confrontation is going to restore your faith in speaking up. Here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever witnessed discrimination happening to someone else and stayed silent because you weren't sure if speaking up would make things better or worse? Be honest in the comments because what Keturah just did, documenting everything and confronting the person directly, might just change how you think about those moments. For 5 long minutes after Patricia disappeared into the cockpit, the cabin remained in a state of suspended tension. Passengers whispered to each other. The black students sat quietly, some holding hands across the aisles, all of them wondering what would happen next. Mrs. Okonkwo stood near the front, her posture rigid with controlled anger, waiting. And Keturah sat in her seat with her tablet still clutched in her hands, trying to slow her racing heart, trying to process what she'd just done. She'd confronted an adult. She'd accused a flight attendant of discrimination in front of dozens of witnesses. She'd refused to back down even when threatened. And now there was nothing to do but wait and see if anyone would actually listen, if anything would actually change, or if this would be like so many other times when people spoke up and nothing happened. Azariah leaned close and whispered, "What do you think they're doing up there?" "I don't know," Keturah whispered back. "Maybe talking to the captain. Maybe calling someone on the ground. What if they don't believe you? What if Patricia convinces them you were lying?" Keturah looked down at her tablet. "I have evidence. Over an hour of it. They can listen to it themselves." But even as she said it, a small voice in her head wondered if evidence would be enough. Adults had a way of explaining things away, of finding reasons why what looked like discrimination was actually something else, something less serious, something that could be dismissed or minimized. And then the curtain separating the galley from the cabin pushed open, and a man stepped through. He was Asian, probably in his late 30s, wearing the same navy blue uniform as Patricia but with additional stripes on his sleeve that indicated rank. His name tag read Marcus Chin, lead flight attendant. His expression was serious, professional but not hostile. He carried himself with the kind of calm authority that came from years of handling difficult situations at 30,000 feet. Marcus's eyes scanned the cabin, taking in the abandoned lunch cart still sitting in the aisle, the passengers watching him expectantly, the cluster of students who were clearly the center of whatever had happened. His gaze settled on Mrs. Okonkwo first, then moved to Keturah. He approached them with measured steps, and when he spoke, his voice was professional but not cold. "Good afternoon. I'm Marcus Chin, the lead flight attendant on this aircraft. I understand there's been an incident. Can you tell me what happened?" Mrs. Okonkwo straightened her shoulders and began speaking in the calm, measured tone of an educator who dealt with difficult situations for over 2 decades. "Mr. Chin, my name is Adiz Okonkwo. I'm a teacher at Oakwood Elementary in Oakland, and I'm responsible for these 32 students on this field trip. What happened is that your flight attendant, Patricia Hendricks, has been systematically treating my black students differently than my white students since we boarded this aircraft." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Can you be more specific?" Mrs. Okonkwo could. She was very specific. She detailed the snack service where black students weren't offered choices, the bathroom incident with Benaya, the seating situation with Tabitha, the lunch service where Azariah's documented food allergy was dismissed. She spoke clearly, factually, without raising her voice or showing anger, presenting each incident like evidence in a court case. When she finished, Marcus turned to Keturah. "And you recorded these incidents?" Keturah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, sir. On my tablet. The whole thing. Every interaction. I can play it for you if you want." "I would appreciate that." Keturah's hands shook slightly as she pulled up the audio file. Over an hour and 43 minutes long now. She fast-forwarded to the snack service, let Marcus listen to Patricia's warm voice offering choices to white students, then her cold, clipped tone handing snacks to black students without asking. Fast-forwarded again to Benaya and the bathroom, to Tabitha and the seating, to Azariah and the lunch. Marcus listened with his head slightly bowed, eyes closed, concentrating on every word, every tone shift, every piece of evidence that Keturah had carefully documented. And as he listened, Keturah watched his jaw tighten, his expression grow darker, his professional composure barely containing what looked like genuine anger. When the recording reached the part where Patricia had grabbed for Keturah's tablet, Marcus held up his hand. "That's enough. Thank you." He looked at Keturah with something that might have been respect. "You documented all of this yourself?" "Yes, sir. My mom's a journalist. She taught me to always document things if I think something wrong is happening." "Your mother taught you well." Marcus straightened up. "I need to speak with some other passengers. I'll be back shortly." For the next 10 minutes, Marcus walked through the cabin, quietly approaching passengers who'd been seated near the incidents. He spoke to the white woman in row 17 who'd spoken up during the confrontation. He talked to the white man across the aisle who'd witnessed the snack service. He interviewed the white parent who'd seen Patricia dismiss Azariah's allergy. He even spoke to some of the white students from Keturah's class, asking them gentle questions about what they'd noticed, what they'd been offered, how Patricia had treated them versus how she treated their black classmates. Every conversation lasted just a few minutes, but Keturah could see the pattern in Marcus's face. With each passenger he spoke to, his expression grew more grave, more troubled, more resolved. The white woman in row 17 was particularly vocal. Her voice carried just far enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I was actually uncomfortable with how she was treating the other children. I almost said something myself, but I wasn't sure if I was reading too much into it. But watching that little girl have the courage to speak up made me realize I should have said something earlier. What I witnessed was absolutely discriminatory." A white father traveling with his own children added, "My daughter got offered 3 choices for her snack. The black kids got handed whatever the attendant decided. I noticed it at the time but told myself maybe I was wrong. I wasn't wrong." One of the white students from Oakwood Elementary, a girl named Rebecca, told Marcus quietly, "Patricia was really nice to me and my friends. But she wasn't nice to Jemima and Azariah and the others. She talked to us different. I didn't know what to do. I felt bad but I didn't say anything." Marcus thanked each person, took notes on a small pad he'd pulled from his pocket, and when he'd spoken to at least a dozen witnesses, he returned to where Keturah and Mrs. Okonkwo waited. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," he said to Keturah, and his voice was gentle now, the professional distance replaced with genuine appreciation. You were very brave to speak up. Not many adults would have had your courage, let alone a 10-year-old. Keturah felt her eyes start to water, but she blinked the tears back. Thank you, sir. Marcus nodded, then his expression hardened again as he turned and walked toward the cockpit. He pushed through the curtain, and though the passengers couldn't hear what was being said, they could see shadows moving behind the thin barrier, could sense an intense conversation happening. 3 minutes later, Marcus emerged again, and this time Patricia was with him. Her face was blotchy red, her eyes puffy like she'd been crying, her earlier composure completely shattered. She looked furious and terrified at the same time, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Marcus's voice was firm, loud enough for everyone in the surrounding rows to hear clearly. Patricia, you're being removed from service for the remainder of this flight. We'll be conducting a full investigation once we land, and you'll be placed on immediate suspension pending the results. Patricia's face went from red to pale. This is ridiculous. That child is lying, she's made all of this up. Marcus cut her off, his voice sharp now, the professional courtesy gone. Multiple passengers have corroborated her account. I've listened to nearly 2 hours of audio documentation that clearly demonstrates discriminatory behavior. And I've been informed that we have our own security footage from the cabin cameras that will be reviewed as part of the investigation. This is not a debate, Patricia. Please proceed to the crew rest area immediately. But Now, Patricia. The cabin was completely silent. Every single passenger was watching this unfold. Patricia stood there for a moment longer, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, and then her eyes found Keturah. The look she gave that 10-year-old girl was pure venom. Hatred and rage, and something that looked like disbelief that a child had been the one to bring her down. It was the look of someone who'd been getting away with something for years and couldn't comprehend that it had finally caught up with her. But Keturah didn't look away. She held Patricia's gaze, her chin lifted, her expression calm despite the fear coursing through her. Because she knew she'd done the right thing. She knew her documentation was solid. She knew multiple witnesses backed her up. And she knew that look in Patricia's eyes was the look of someone who'd finally been held accountable. Another flight attendant, a young woman who'd been working in a different section, appeared to escort Patricia to the crew rest area. As Patricia disappeared toward the back of the plane, the cabin erupted in quiet applause. It started with the white woman in row 17, then spread through the section. Not loud, not obnoxious, but genuine appreciation for a child who'd shown more courage and integrity than most adults ever would. Passengers nodded at Keturah, smiled at her, some even gave her thumbs up. And then Keturah's classmates surrounded her. Jemima squeezed into the row, wrapping Keturah in a tight hug. Azariah was already there, holding her hand. Benaiah leaned over from the row behind, his voice thick with emotion. You stood up for all of us. You didn't have to do that, but you did. Tabitha, tears streaming down her face, whispered, Nobody's ever stood up for me like that before. Keturah felt overwhelmed by their gratitude, by the weight of what she'd done. She looked at her friends, these kids she'd known since kindergarten, and said quietly, My parents always say injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's Martin Luther King Jr. I just remembered that. If I let it happen to you guys and didn't say anything, then I was part of the problem. Mrs. Okonkwo, standing nearby with tears in her eyes, nodded slowly. Those were lessons she'd taught in her classroom, concepts she'd tried to instill in her students for years. But seeing a 10-year-old actually live those principles, actually embody that kind of courage, was something else entirely. Marcus returned to their section with 2 other flight attendants. I want to personally apologize to all of you, he said, addressing the black students directly. What happened on this flight was completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of our airline. We will be making this right. And then he did something remarkable. He personally went to each black student in the section and offered them a full choice of meals. He brought Azariah her chicken pasta with an extra dessert and a sincere apology. He moved Tabitha to a premium economy seat that had opened up, one with extra legroom and more space. He brought Benaiah extra snacks and told him he should never have been asked to sit down for simply waiting in line. He made sure every single black student on that flight knew that what had happened to them was wrong, that their discomfort mattered, that they deserved to be treated with the same dignity and respect as everyone else. The rest of the flight passed peacefully. The tension that had permeated the cabin for 2 hours finally dissipated. Kids started talking again, laughing again, getting excited about Washington, D.C. again. But something had shifted. Something fundamental had changed in that cabin. Mrs. Okonkwo pulled Keturah aside as other students settled back into their seats. You did something very difficult today. Something most adults couldn't do. Your parents raised you well. Keturah looked up at her teacher, this woman who'd been teaching for over 2 decades, who'd seen so much, who'd probably experienced her own share of discrimination over the years. I was scared, she admitted quietly. Really scared. But I knew if I didn't say something she'd keep doing it to other kids. To other people. And I couldn't just let that happen. Mrs. Okonkwo squeezed her shoulder gently. That's what courage is, Keturah. Being scared but doing the right thing anyway. You showed everyone on this plane what that looks like. And then something else started happening, something Keturah hadn't expected. The white students in their class began approaching the black students. Tentatively at first, uncertain how to address what had happened, but compelled by something, guilt, maybe, or a dawning awareness of their own silence. Rebecca, a white girl who sat near Keturah in their classroom at school, came over first. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying. I'm sorry I didn't say anything earlier. I noticed how she was treating you guys different, but I wasn't sure if I should say something. I thought maybe it wasn't my place or maybe I was wrong. But I should have said something. I'm really sorry. Another white student, a boy named Thomas, nodded. I felt weird about how nice she was being to us compared to you guys. But I didn't know what to do. I'm sorry too. More white students came forward, offering apologies, expressing discomfort with what they'd witnessed, admitting they'd stayed silent when they should have spoken up. And the black students, these kids who'd spent 2 hours being treated as less than, who had every right to be angry and hurt, showed remarkable grace. It's okay, Azariah said, though her voice was still shaky. It's hard to know what to do when adults are being unfair. But we should have tried, Rebecca insisted. Keturah did. She's 10 years old, same as us, and she had the courage to speak up. We should have backed her up. And then, right there at 30,000 feet, still an hour from landing, these 5th graders had a conversation that many adults never managed to have. They talked about what they'd witnessed. About why it was wrong. About why silence in the face of injustice was itself a kind of participation in that injustice. About what allyship actually meant, not just feeling bad when discrimination happened but actively speaking up, actively supporting, actively standing with people who were being treated unfairly. Mrs. Okonkwo watched this unfold with tears streaming down her face. She'd been planning lessons about civil rights for their Washington D.C. trip. She'd prepared lectures about courage and activism and standing up for what's right. But none of those prepared lessons could have taught what these children were learning right now, in this moment, through this experience. The field trip had become something entirely different than what she'd planned. It had become an unexpected, painful, but ultimately powerful lesson in courage and allyship and the importance of using your voice even when it's scary. An hour later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. The plane began its descent into Washington, D.C. Kids pressed their faces against the windows, trying to catch glimpses of the monuments they'd be visiting. The excitement returned, but it was different now. Tempered by what had happened. Deepened by the conversations they'd had. When the wheels touched down on the runway and the plane taxied to the gate, Marcus made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Washington, D.C. Before we disembark, I want to address what happened on this flight today. Our airline has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. A full investigation will be conducted, and appropriate action will be taken. To the students of Oakwood Elementary, and particularly to the young woman who had the courage to document and report what she experienced, thank you. You taught everyone on this aircraft an important lesson today. The cabin applauded again, and Keturah felt her face get hot with embarrassment. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She'd just done what her parents taught her to do. When the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began gathering their belongings, Marcus approached Keturah one more time. Your father is waiting at the gate. I called ahead to let him know what happened. He's very proud of you. Keturah's heart leaped. Her father was here. Her father, who taught her about civil rights and justice and standing up for what's right. Her father, who she'd sent that audio recording to, who'd probably listened to every second of it, who would understand exactly what she'd experienced and why she'd done what she'd done. The students filed off the plane, tired and emotionally drained but also somehow energized by what had happened. As Keturah walked up the jet bridge, her tablet tucked safely in her backpack, her classmates surrounding her like a protective circle, she felt different than she had when she'd boarded that plane 3 hours earlier. She felt stronger, braver, more certain that her voice mattered, that speaking up was worth it, that one person, even a 10-year-old person, could make a difference. When she emerged into the gate area, she saw them immediately. Her father, tall and dignified in his suit, his eyes scanning the crowd for her. her mother wiping tears from her face even though she was smiling. They'd flown out that morning when they received her email, had been waiting for hours to make sure she was okay. Keturah ran to them and her father scooped her up in his arms even though she was really too big for that now. "I'm so proud of you, Tura," he whispered into her hair. "So incredibly proud." Her mother hugged them both, her voice thick with emotion. "You used your voice when it mattered most. You documented everything like I taught you. You stood up for your friends. Baby, you were amazing." Marcus approached the family and Keturah's parents turned to face him, their expressions guarded, still protective of their daughter. "Mr. and Mrs. Abioye, I'm Marcus Chin, the lead flight attendant on today's flight. Your daughter showed extraordinary maturity and bravery today. She documented clear evidence of discriminatory behavior and spoke up when many adults would have stayed silent. The airline will be conducting a full investigation, and we're implementing immediate retraining for all staff. I want you to know that what happened today will lead to real change." Keturah's father, the civil rights attorney who'd spent his career fighting discrimination in courtrooms, shook Marcus's hand. "Thank you for listening to her. Thank you for taking action." "She made it impossible not to," Marcus said simply. The evidence she compiled was irrefutable. Over the next week, as the 5th grade class explored Washington, D.C., visiting the Lincoln Memorial and the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, news spread about what had happened on that flight. The airline conducted its investigation. Patricia Hendricks was terminated within 72 hours. Her employment ended not just because of the incidents on that one flight, but because the investigation revealed a pattern of similar complaints over her 15-year career that had been dismissed or minimized. The airline issued a public apology, acknowledging that they'd failed their passengers and promising to do better. They implemented new anti-discrimination protocols, new training programs, new systems for reporting and investigating complaints of bias. And Keturah's recording, with her family's permission, became part of the airline's mandatory training program for all flight attendants. Thousands of airline employees would eventually hear her calm, clear voice documenting discrimination as it happened, would hear Patricia's different tones with different passengers, would learn from a 10-year-old girl what discrimination looked like in real time and why it was never acceptable. The 5th grade class from Oakwood Elementary returned to Oakland a week later, changed by their experience. Not just by the monuments they'd seen or the history they'd learned, but by what had happened on that flight. By watching one of their own stand up for what was right. By learning that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about being scared but acting anyway. By understanding that allyship meant speaking up even when it was uncomfortable, even when it wasn't happening to you. And Keturah returned home with a deeper understanding of why her parents had raised her the way they had. Why they'd taught her about civil rights at the dinner table. Why they'd given her tools to document injustice. Why they'd told her again and again that her voice mattered. Because moments like the one on that airplane happened all the time. Injustice showed up in small ways and large ways, in obvious forms and subtle forms, and the world needed people brave enough to notice it, document it, and speak up about it. Even if those people were only 10 years old. If Keturah's story moved you and you want more stories about ordinary people showing extraordinary courage, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another powerful story like this one. And here's my final question for you. After hearing what Keturah did at just 10 years old, what's stopping you from speaking up the next time you witness injustice? Think about it and share your honest answer in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is admit where we've been silent and commit to being braver going forward. You know, as I sit here thinking about everything that happened on that flight, about this 10-year-old girl who stood up when so many adults stayed seated, I can't help but reflect on what this story really means for all of us. Keturah was just 10 years old. 10. Most kids that age are worried about homework, about making the soccer team, about whether their crush likes them back. They're not supposed to be standing in airplane aisles confronting discrimination, documenting evidence like seasoned investigators, facing down adults who have all the power while they have none. But here's what Keturah understood, what she grasped with a clarity that honestly puts most of us to shame. Silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit. It makes us part of the problem. Not speaking up isn't neutral. It's not staying out of it. It's choosing a side, the wrong side. Think about that for a moment. A 5th grader understood that staying quiet when her friends were being mistreated wasn't just the easy path, it was the wrong path. She understood that witnessing discrimination and doing nothing about it meant she was allowing it to continue. That's a level of moral clarity that many adults spend their entire lives never achieving. And here's the thing that really gets me, Keturah didn't have authority. She wasn't a supervisor or a manager or someone with official power. She didn't have wealth that could threaten the airline's bottom line. She didn't have influence or connections or any of the things we usually think of as power. She was a child. A passenger. Someone who, in the normal hierarchy of an airplane, has essentially zero authority over the flight crew. But what she did have was courage. Raw, genuine courage. The kind that makes your hands shake and your heart pound but you do the right thing anyway. The kind that knows speaking up might make things worse but speaks up because staying silent is unacceptable. And she had preparation. This is so crucial and I don't want us to miss it. Keturah's courage didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't some magical quality she was born with. Her father, Chikwudi, spent years teaching her about civil rights, about justice, about standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Those dinner table conversations that might have seemed boring to other kids? They were preparing her. They were giving her the framework to understand what she was witnessing, the language to articulate why it was wrong, the conviction to believe that speaking up mattered. Her mother, Amara, taught her to document everything. As a journalist, she understood the power of evidence, the importance of having proof, the way that documentation transforms, she said, into something undeniable. When Keturah pulled out that tablet and hit record, she wasn't just randomly deciding to capture what was happening. She was applying lessons her mother had taught her, using tools she'd been given, following a methodology she'd learned. Think about how deliberate that preparation was. How intentional. Keturah's parents didn't just tell her to be a good person. They equipped her with specific knowledge, specific skills, specific tools that would allow her to be effective when the moment demanded it. They taught her what discrimination looked like so she could recognize it when she saw it. They taught her about her rights so she wouldn't be intimidated into silence. They taught her documentation techniques so she'd have proof that couldn't be dismissed. And when that moment came, when she was sitting in that middle seat watching Patricia hand out pretzels without asking, watching Benaya get told to sit down, watching Tabitha get dismissed, Keturah was ready. Not because she wanted to be a hero. Not because she was looking for attention or trying to make a scene. But because every lesson her parents had taught her, every value they'd instilled, every skill they'd helped her develop all came together in that moment and told her, "This is wrong, you have the tools to document it and you must not stay silent." And here's what makes this even more profound. Keturah didn't just protect herself. She could have stayed quiet. Patricia wasn't being particularly rude to her personally. Keturah could have accepted her pretzels, eaten her turkey sandwich, and landed in Washington, D.C. without making waves. Her field trip would have continued. She wouldn't have had a confrontation. She wouldn't have had to feel scared or worried about what might happen. But she didn't do that. Because it wasn't about her. It was about Jemima, who was fighting back tears after being dismissed when she asked for cookies. It was about Benaya, who'd been humiliated for simply waiting in line for the bathroom. It was about Azariah, whose serious food allergy was treated like an inconvenience. It was about Tabitha, who'd been told to just deal with being uncomfortable while a white student got moved to a better seat. Keturah protected her friends. Her classmates. The kids she'd known since kindergarten, who she'd grown up with, who she cared about. She used her voice not just for herself but for them. And in doing so, she probably protected countless future passengers, people she'd never meet, would never know, who would have endured Patricia's discrimination if someone hadn't finally documented it, reported it, made it impossible to ignore or dismiss. That's the kind of courage we should all aspire to. Not the courage to protect ourselves, that comes naturally. But the courage to protect others, even when it costs us something, even when it puts us at risk, even when we could just stay quiet and avoid the whole mess. Now, let me talk about what this story means beyond just that one flight, beyond just Keturah and Patricia, beyond just those 2 hours at 30,000 feet. Because this isn't really a story about one discriminatory flight attendant. It's not even primarily about one brave little girl as remarkable as she was. This story is about systems. It's about the structures and institutions that allow discrimination to thrive, to persist, to continue year after year, incident after incident, complaint after complaint. Patricia Hendricks had been a flight attendant for 15 years. 15 years. And the investigation revealed a pattern of similar complaints throughout her career. That means what happened to Keturah and her classmates wasn't an isolated incident, wasn't a bad day, wasn't a misunderstanding. It was Patricia's normal behavior. Her standard operating procedure. The way she'd been treating passengers, specifically black passengers, for over a decade. And those complaints had been dismissed, minimized, swept under the rug. What? Because the system allowed it? Because there wasn't sufficient documentation? Because it was passengers' word against an employee's word, and the airline gave their employee the benefit of the doubt? Because people who witnessed it stayed quiet, either not recognizing the discrimination or not wanting to get involved. Because the passengers who experienced it often didn't have the tools or knowledge or courage to fight back effectively. That's how discrimination persists. Not usually through dramatic, obvious acts of hatred, but through these small, subtle, deniable actions that happen over and over, day after day, flight after flight. A warmer tone with some passengers and a colder tone with others. Choices offered to some and not to others. Assistance provided freely to some and denied to others. Each incident small enough that it might be nothing, but together forming a clear, undeniable pattern. And this discrimination thrives when good people stay silent. That's the hard truth we need to face. Patricia got away with this behavior for 15 years not just because the airline failed in its oversight, but because hundreds, maybe thousands of passengers witnessed her discriminatory behavior and said nothing. They noticed the different treatment. They felt uncomfortable about it. But they told themselves maybe they were reading too much into it, maybe it wasn't their place to say something, maybe they were wrong. We saw it happen in real time on that flight. Passengers witnessed the snack service. They saw Patricia offer choices to white students and hand pretzels to black students. Some of them noticed. Some of them felt that twinge of, something isn't right here. But they stayed quiet. They didn't want to cause trouble. They didn't want to be wrong. They didn't want to get involved. Until Keturah forced the issue. Until she made it impossible to ignore. Until she stood in that aisle with her tablet and her evidence in her trembling hands and said, "This is wrong, I have proof and I'm not staying quiet about it." And suddenly, those passengers who'd been silent found their voices. Suddenly they were willing to corroborate her story, to confirm what they'd witnessed, to admit that yes, they'd noticed the discrimination too. That's what we need to understand. Discrimination doesn't disappear because we pretend not to see it. It disappears when enough people refuse to accept it, when enough witnesses speak up, when enough allies use their voices and their privilege to say, this is not okay. And that brings me to another crucial lesson from this story. We need to teach our children not just to endure unfairness, but to challenge it intelligently and bravely. Think about how many times we tell kids to just deal with things, to not make waves, to respect authority even when that authority is wrong. Do what the teacher says. Don't talk back to adults. Just ignore it. It's not worth the trouble. We teach them compliance. We teach them to accept unfair treatment as long as it's coming from someone older or more powerful. We teach them that keeping the peace is more important than standing up for what's right. And then we wonder why, as adults, they struggle to confront injustice, why they stay silent when they witness discrimination, why they don't speak up when something is clearly wrong. Keturah's parents took a different approach. They taught her to think critically about fairness. They taught her to recognize injustice. They taught her that authority doesn't make someone right, that adults can be wrong, that sometimes the brave thing is to challenge what you're being told to accept. They gave her the intellectual framework and the moral courage to stand up even when it was scary, even when it put her at risk, even when every instinct told her to sit down and be quiet. And look at what happened. Because of that education, because of that preparation, Keturah was able to do something remarkable. She didn't just complain. She didn't just feel bad about what was happening. She documented it methodically, she reported it appropriately, and when the adults around her couldn't or wouldn't fix it, she took action herself. Intelligently. Strategically. Effectively. That's what we should be teaching every child. Not blind obedience. Not passive acceptance of whatever treatment they receive. But critical thinking, moral courage, strategic action, and the understanding that speaking up against injustice is not just their right, it's their responsibility. And here's something beautiful that came out of this situation. Keturah's classmates learned an unforgettable lesson that day. A lesson that no textbook could teach, no classroom discussion could fully convey. They learned that age doesn't determine impact. That being young doesn't mean being powerless. That courage is more important than authority, that conviction matters more than credentials, that doing the right thing doesn't require being the biggest or the oldest or the most powerful person in the room. Those 32 fifth graders watched one of their own stand up to an adult. They watched her refuse to back down when threatened. They watched her use her voice and her evidence and her courage to force change. And they learned something that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. They matter. Their voices matter. Their observations matter. Their sense of right and wrong matters. They don't have to wait until they're adults to make a difference. Think about the impact of that lesson. These kids returned to Oakland fundamentally changed. Not just by the monuments they saw or the history they learned in Washington, D.C., but by what they witnessed on that airplane. They learned what real courage looks like. They learned what effective allyship means. Not just feeling bad when discrimination happens, but actively speaking up, actively supporting, actively standing with people who are being treated unfairly. The white students in that class learned they have a responsibility to use their voices when they see discrimination, that their silence makes them complicit, that noticing unfair treatment and saying nothing is itself a form of participation in that unfairness. The black students learned they don't have to accept discrimination, that they can document it and report it and demand better, that their dignity and their right to fair treatment are not negotiable. Those are life-changing lessons. And they happened because a 10-year-old girl decided that staying silent was unacceptable. But this story isn't just a lesson for children. It's a lesson for adults too. For every adult who witnessed what was happening on that flight and stayed quiet until a child forced them to speak up. For every adult who's ever noticed discrimination and told themselves it wasn't their place to say something. For every adult who's seen unfairness and convinced themselves they were probably reading too much into it. The adults watching Keturah that day learned something uncomfortable. Sometimes the youngest among us show us how to be better. Sometimes a child has to teach us what courage looks like. Sometimes it takes someone who hasn't yet learned all the social conventions about staying quiet and not causing trouble and not making waves to show us that those conventions are wrong, that they serve injustice, that they need to be challenged. That's humbling. It should be humbling. A 10-year-old girl showed more moral courage in 2 hours than most adults show in years. She did what was right even though it was scary, even though she had everything to lose and nothing tangible to gain, even though every social pressure told her to sit down and be quiet and let the adults handle it. And she changed things. Real, concrete things. Patricia Hendricks lost her job, not because of one complaint, but because Keturah's documentation and the subsequent investigation revealed a pattern that could no longer be ignored or minimized. The airline implemented new training programs, new reporting systems, new protocols to identify and address discrimination. Thousands of flight attendants now learn from Keturah's recording what discrimination looks like and why it's unacceptable. How many future passengers will be treated fairly because Keturah spoke up? How many people will never experience what Jemima and Benaiah and Azariah and Tabitha experienced because one fifth grader decided to document injustice instead of accepting it? We can't know the exact number, but we know it's not zero. We know Keturah's courage rippled outward, creating change that extended far beyond that single flight. That's the power of speaking up. That's the impact one person can have. Even when that person is just 10 years old. Even when they're scared. Even when they have no official authority or power. Even when everything about the situation suggests they should stay quiet. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. Really sit with it. What would you have done in Keturah's position? If you were sitting in that middle seat, watching discrimination happen to your friends, your classmates, people you cared about, what would you have done? Would you have noticed the pattern? Would you have recognized that Patricia's different tones, her selective warmth, her inconsistent treatment wasn't just coincidence or a bad day but actual discrimination? Or would you have told yourself you were reading too much into it, being too sensitive, imagining things? And if you did notice, would you have done anything about it? Would you have had the presence of mind to document it like Keturah did? Would you have thought to record the evidence, to capture proof that couldn't be dismissed or denied? Or would you have just watched it happen, feeling uncomfortable but not knowing what to do about it? And if you did document it, would you have had the courage to speak up? To tell your teacher? To confront Patricia directly when the teacher's complaint didn't work? To stand in that aisle with your hands shaking and your heart pounding and refuse to back down even when threatened? Or would you have sent the recording to your parents and hoped they'd handle it after the flight, avoiding the confrontation, staying safe, not making yourself a target? Be honest with yourself. Because I think most of us, if we're really honest, would have stayed quiet. We would have noticed something was wrong, felt uncomfortable about it, but convinced ourselves it wasn't our place to say something. We would have told ourselves we might be wrong, that we didn't want to cause trouble, that the adults would handle it, that speaking up might make things worse. And that's exactly how discrimination persists. That's exactly how people like Patricia Hendricks get away with treating people unfairly for 15 years. Not because everyone agrees with their behavior, but because good people stay silent. Because witnesses don't speak up. Because it's easier and safer and less stressful to just accept what's happening and move on with your day. Keturah could have done that. She could have accepted her pretzels and her turkey sandwich and landed in Washington, D.C. without making waves. Her field trip would have continued. She wouldn't have been scared or stressed. She wouldn't have had to stand up to an adult, risk being labeled a troublemaker, worry about what might happen. But she didn't do that. Because she understood something that many adults never learn. That convenience and comfort are not more important than justice. That avoiding trouble is not more important than stopping discrimination. that staying safe is not more important than protecting people who are being hurt. So here's my challenge to you. The next time you witness injustice, whether it's subtle discrimination like what happened on that flight or something more obvious, ask yourself, what would Keturah do? Would she stay quiet to avoid trouble? Or would she find the courage to speak up? And then be like Keturah. Notice the patterns. Document what you see. Speak up when it matters. Stand with people who are being treated unfairly. Use whatever privilege, whatever platform, whatever voice you have to challenge injustice. Even when it's scary. Even when it costs you something. Even when it would be so much easier to stay quiet. Because here's the truth that Keturah understood at 10 years old. Injustice doesn't disappear because we ignore it. It doesn't go away because we pretend not to see it. It doesn't stop because we convince ourselves it's not our problem or not our place to speak up. Injustice disappears when we refuse to accept it. When we document it, report it, speak up about it, demand better. When we stand with people who are being treated unfairly. When we use our voices and our courage and our conviction to say, this is not okay, this needs to change, and I will not stay silent about it. That's how systems change. That's how discriminatory behavior gets identified and stopped. That's how airlines implement new training programs and new protocols. That's how flight attendants lose their jobs when they treat passengers differently based on skin color. Not because injustice magically solves itself, but because people like Keturah refuse to let it continue unchallenged. You have that power too. Right now. Today. You don't need to be wealthy or influential or powerful. You don't need to have authority or credentials or a platform. You just need courage. The courage to notice injustice. The courage to document it. The courage to speak up about it. The courage to stand with people who are being treated unfairly. If a 10-year-old girl can do it at 30,000 feet with everything stacked against her, what's stopping you? If this story moved you and you want to see more stories about ordinary people showing extraordinary courage, hit that subscribe button right now. And here's what I really want to know. What's stopping you from speaking up the next time you witness injustice? Leave your honest answer in the comments below, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is admit where we've been silent and commit to being braver going forward. Remember what Keturah taught us. Injustice doesn't disappear because we ignore it. It disappears when we refuse to accept it. So let's refuse to accept it. Let's be the witnesses who speak up. Let's be the allies who stand with people being treated unfairly. Let's be the change we want to see. Thanks for watching.